And so my health background means that I'm still somewhat apprehensive about how the next few months are going to pan out in the pandemic. But we're not focusing today on the sort of theme of rebuilding. And Microsoft has taken and you've taken quite a strong personal stand, saying that rebuilding our economy is really an opportunity for us to tackle some of our tough challenges. So what do you think we should focus our energies on that would give us maybe that, that sort of synergy of impacts will be a multiplier in terms of impacts as we come out of the depth of the pandemic?
Well, let me start by highlighting three things. I mean, one, since you were talking about the pandemic, I think it's very important that when we reach the day when COVID-19 is finally in the rearview mirror, we ensure that we invest in a public health infrastructure that will be ready for a future epidemic or pandemic. As I've talked oftentimes with leaders in Asian countries, one of the obvious lessons is that they dealt with SARS a decade ago, and in North America, we dealt with a huge influenza a century ago. It turns out that you're better prepared if you dealt with something just 10 years ago. Canada, like the United States, obviously has a federal infrastructure, division of responsibility for public health. But I think that there's an important question where we should learn from countries like Japan is just one example of how to strengthen that on an ongoing basis, put in place the data resources to identify and manage these kinds of things, and mobilize a response so that hopefully if this happens again, we will be better prepared. I think second, we need to create jobs. We're going to be coming out of this with the greatest jobs deficit that we faced in a long time. I do believe that one of the tools that can create jobs is the adoption of more digital technologies that can help companies either enter a new market, expand their lines of business, boost productivity. We've seen digitization advance during the pandemic, and in a world where digitization is advancing globally, I think fortune will favor the countries that continue to lean into that trend. But then ultimately, we need to make this recovery more inclusive. And that means that it needs to be a future that is open to everyone. I think that has to, in some ways start with having broadband connectivity ubiquitously and inexpensively available. And Canada, like the United States, has very important populations that are in rural communities. I always enjoy and appreciate the fact that every conversation like this, every event like this in Canada starts with an appreciation and acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples. But I think we need to focus on the fact that the Indigenous peoples in Canada, like the United States, and many rural communities don't enjoy the same level of broadband connectivity, and we need to invest in skills. Giving people digital technology is a halfway solution if we don't also provide access to the digital skills that people will need. And we've been huge participants and supporters and learners from this ourselves in, say, working with the BC Institute of Technology is just one example, where I think that there are such important institutions across Canada that are leading the way, that can lead the way. But I think we're approaching a new era when employers are going to need to invest more in the skilling of their employees. And I think government has a role in supporting that as well.
Yeah, so particularly around this issue of accessible and more equitable digital access, can you talk a little bit more about the role of corporate leadership and how you see new models of collaboration, both with government and those communities, those rural communities that often are more knowledgeable about the needs of their local regions? How do we do this differently next time, rather than just point finger at the other guys building infrastructure or doing their piece?
Well, there's a couple of thoughts that I would offer. I mean, first, in the world of business or anywhere, we often talk about the need for role clarity. Having people do each other's jobs is not as good as having role clarity. And what's even worse is when everybody just points the finger at everybody else. And that often is a reflection of a lack of role clarity. And in any country that is organized with a spirit of federalism, as obviously Canada and the United States both are, I think that actually the pandemic has played a role in clarifying, for example, that oftentimes it is at the provincial level that public health leadership most resides. I think more broadly, asking ourselves, where can we look in Canada for the provinces to lead and the federal government to support, and where do we look for that to be the other way around? I do believe ultimately in a large country like Canada or the United States, there is a need for federal support to fill in the broadband gaps. There is a need for accurate national data, and there will be a need for some level of subsidization. But ultimately, I'm also a big believer in harnessing the market and using government support to prime the market and then hopefully create an environment where the market can take off. And oftentimes, I think if done well, when it comes to some of these kinds of investments, including in the communications space, I think especially with new technologies, especially with a world where we have new forms of wireless connectivity and low Earth orbiting satellites, we should be optimistic about the role that the market can play in the future. And then fundamentally, I think it's always important to talk about how there's really three pillars here, and the third is civil society. It's the great nonprofits that operate at a local or provincial or national level. Here, Canada obviously has such important nonprofits that play a critical role. I think that the ultimate solution to almost all big problems today really requires that we bring government, business, and the nonprofit communities together, and that's I think part of what we've seen, in places not just Ontario or Quebec, but a lot of what I experience in BC and Vancouver, which is basically, that this is our nearest neighbor. When we think about our next door neighbor, if you're in Seattle, the first word that comes to the tip of our tongue is Vancouver.
Mm-hmm. And I would say certainly the pandemic has highlighted this issue of digital infrastructure and access. And of course, that is just amplified when we start to think about rebuilding and creating those jobs that you mentioned. Are there certain, do you think, rules and regulations that need to be set up front to ensure that effort to both build out digital infrastructure and sort of mobilize the capacity around that is more inclusive, is more fair, genuinely tackles the places where the market may not work?
Well, absolutely. And I think you're right to identify the points where the market may not work. And I think that in the world or in Canada today, I think there's two different questions that are always worth asking. One is, are there parts of the population that the market is not reaching? We live in a world where there always are. And this may be parts of the country that technology is not reaching. Again, broadband and devices, I think, are good examples of that. And I think one then has to ask, well, how do you, create solutions to fill in those gaps? I think in the environment today, we should be thinking about digital skills as well. I mean, we're very committed in bringing down the cost of access to digital skills and extending their reach through technology itself. I mean, through LinkedIn Learning, we have a broad initiative. We have an initiative underway right now to reach 25 million people worldwide with new digital skills by the end of this year. And by the end of September, we were almost at the halfway mark of what is a 6-month initiative. But let's put technology to work where it can help fill the void, and that's one way of tapping the market. I do think that the other part of law and regulation is really thinking about where the market may work in a way that just leads to sort of a disproportionate balance or imbalance, if you will, between power and the protection of people's rights. I think that Canada has long been a leader in the protection of privacy. And it's something that we've certainly sought to pay close attention to at Microsoft. It's why we built data centers in Canada. It's why we store Canadian citizens' data in Canada. It's why we're always interested in ensuring that we remain at the forefront of the protection of people's privacy rights. For us, it's sort of part of the value proposition we seek to bring, if you will. But I think that is one good example of what is going to be a growing set of issues where governments are going to, frankly, in this decade, be asking hard questions of the tech sector about whether they feel that people's rights are being adequately protected as they use digital technology more broadly.
So interesting. I mean, the whole issue, obviously, post COVID-19 around reskilling, upskilling, using it almost as a catch-up or a leapfrog as the digital economy has accelerated and really made its way through even our traditional sectors over the last few months. You talked a bit about the role of technology, but I'm intrigued by also what is the role of a big beast like your company, and particularly in an economy like Canada's, which is dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. You're playing a very active role, obviously, in fostering the startup community and supporting tech-based young companies, but is there a role in the reskilling and upskilling that a company like Microsoft can do through its technology platforms to, bring those reskilling and upskilling more broadly into the economy?
Absolutely. I first start by, reflecting for a moment on, I think, the problem we need to solve. And this is the way I would characterize this problem. In the 1980s and 1990s, we saw increasing investment by employers overall in skilling of their employees. And this made sense. It's when the personal computer was going into the workplace. Employees needed to be trained on how to use a computer, how to use a word processing program, how to use email. We then saw 2 decades starting at the turn of the century where employer investments in employee training fell and then stagnated. So here we are, it's the year 2020, and I believe we need investments in employee training to increase. Why? Well, it's because of this rapid digitization. It means that as people get a new job or they go back to a job that was there before, in all likelihood, it will have more digital content to it than it did before, especially as people are using more remote connections for all manner of human activity. But it's not just that. If we look to the decade ahead, as we see artificial intelligence come into the workplace, change the nature of what people do in their jobs, we will need to train all of us to do things in these new ways. So how do we do that? Well, I do think it actually starts by putting digital technology to work. That's where we're creating new learning services, new learning content through LinkedIn. We're launching in the next couple of months in Microsoft Teams, new workflow-based digital training modules that employers can add their own. They can use what comes from the government or otherwise is publicly available and just put it into the workflow for employees. And what this also does is it reduces the cost of training employees. But I would say I personally believe that this is an important time to ask another question. Should, for example, governments offer tax credits to small businesses that would, for example, cover some of the costs of training people that they're hiring to onboard them, offer upskilling for the employees that have been with them for some time. I believe myself that it's the kind of government investment that could not just help stimulate a rebound to the economy, but build a stronger foundation for a decade or two of just the intellectual foundation for ongoing economic growth.
Absolutely, and there's lots more questions I'm sure the audience will have on this front, but I'm intrigued by the fact that sort of under your leadership, Microsoft has taken a bit of a stance on a non-technical related field, in particular around environmental sustainability. And earlier this year, you announced that Microsoft would be carbon negative by 2030. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is a tech company opportunity to really make a significant contribution to this challenge, which obviously is so fundamental to our future?
Well, I think our opportunity is great, and I think our responsibility is perhaps even greater. In many ways, the most important infrastructure of the 21st century, I would argue, is the digital infrastructure that you see in large data centers and the like. We're among the largest operators of data centers on the planet. They run on electricity. It's just an imperative in terms of our doing our role properly that we achieve the goal we set for ourselves, namely of being carbon negative by 2030. We've said all of our data centers worldwide will be running on renewable energy by 2025. And I do believe we have a critical role to play and then working with our supply chain to move them to being carbon negative, creating the methodologies and the digital tools that then any customer can deploy in the private sector, in the public sector. And then I would just say, the climate issue, the carbon issue may be the most important issue, but we've also committed that we'll be water positive by the end of the decade, that we'll be a zero waste company by the end of the decade, that we are partnering with others to build what we call a planetary computer that will provide data sets about the biodiversity, the natural resources of the world, so that communities and countries can manage that as well. So, carbon right now is the tip of the spear, and it should be. We need to do more, but the sustainability needs of the planet are broader still.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate that leadership, and maybe, Yolande, I'll go back to some questions from the audience, although I have many others.
Sure.